everyone. Welcome to the Christ Pearls channel. This is Jessica, and today I want to talk a little bit about something that I've been thinking about because of just so many different things that I've been seeing going on just in the news, on social media, and it's had me thinking a little bit more about America's end time role in the gathering of Israel. So I don't know if you guys saw, but I did a video recently where I talked with Jonathan from the Haystack and Cami from Simply Saints, and we were talking about this idea of being a key clutcher. We got called key clutchers, and it's like this derogatory term that people have been using just to suggest that if you say anything really that suggests that the church has the keys, the authority given by God, then you may end up getting called a key clutcher. Well, in the process of this discussion, I had made this outline for us to follow, and I'm actually in the middle of doing a really beautiful little series that I put together that has like really pretty pictures, kind of like my marriage motif series, where I'm going to dive into this. But we were talking about the lost tribes and how they're not lost to the Lord, and how there is sometimes a little bit of a misunderstanding about what this idea of the Lamanites blossoming as a rose, and the gospel going from like the leadership in the church at this point, who are mostly descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh, out to the rest of the house of Israel. And sometimes there's this idea that like somehow a prophet's going to come up outside of the church and like take over the church, and they're going to be somebody who gathers the Lamanites and these lost tribes. And I had included in here some commentary. This one's by Bruce R. McConkie, and then I also have some by Joseph Fielding Smith. But it basically just kind of explains that this is not quite right. And it talks about how the lost tribes are not lost to the Lord. They're in, like they were a distinct people many hundreds of years after the Lord visited them. But we know through this doctrine of the great apostasy that we have in the church that every branch that the Lord established. So think back to Jacob 5, the allegory of the olive trees, and those 3 spots of ground and those 3 branches, like Judah, Joseph, the lost tribes, that all of these fell into apostasy eventually. And for over 1,000 years, priesthood keys were not in operation on the earth. That's what we covered in this discussion. And I'm going to add to it, I need to clarify a few things that I just don't think came through in the discussion because we kept getting sidetracked, but I'm working on a presentation for that. Well, in there, we talked about how obviously the Lord taught the lost tribes the same things that he taught the Nephites and the Jews in Jerusalem. And in due course, even these tribes of Israel will return and come to the children of Ephraim to receive their blessing. And when it says the children of Ephraim in Doctrine and Covenants 133, this is talking about the church, okay? Because Ephraim has the role of bringing the house of Israel together. This is part of Ephraim's birthright blessing, and so there's like this whole history there, and I've been covering this on the channel because I do think that this is important to understand. It goes back to the story of Joseph in Egypt and his 2 sons and their birthright blessings, and he was the birthright son of Jacob, who became Israel. And so he has this responsibility to gather Israel in the last days, and so he needs to gather the Jews and gather the lost tribes. And this includes like Ephraim and Manasseh. They kind of get gathered first, and then you see the Lord gathering the lost tribes, and then he's going to gather the Jews and then the rest of the people out of all the nations until everybody's gathered in preparation for the second coming of the Lord. And this gathering will actually continue all the way through the millennium. So this doctrine of the gathering plays a huge role in understanding what it means when we say that the Lamanites will blossom as a rose, and then what America's role is in this end time gathering of Israel. And that's why I do a lot of videos on the gathering of Israel, because President Nelson told us to study it. And I can see why, because everything pertains to this. This is the way that the Lord saves his people. He sent Jesus Christ to atone, to be resurrected, to establish a covenant, and then to gather everyone into the covenant. So that's what we're doing. And so it says here, in due course, the lost tribes of Israel will return and come to the children of Ephraim to receive their blessings. This great gathering will take place under the direction of the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for he holds the keys. Keys are the right of presidency, the power to direct. And by this power, the lost tribes will return with their prophets and their scriptures to be crowned with glory, even in Zion, by the hands of the servants of the Lord, even the children of Ephraim. When it talks about their prophets, it's talking about their records and their scriptures. So like the prophets that they had, who we do not have a record of. And they would have had a record too of Jesus Christ appearing to them. We know that Jesus Christ appeared to the Jews, and then he said other sheep, and then he appeared to the Nephites, and he said other sheep he's going to go visit. And he's talking about these other lost tribes who were scattered throughout the earth, and they will have a record of Christ's appearance too. And so eventually all of these things will come forth in time. And this is just an important thing to understand, that it's not going to happen outside of the church. People may gather, but in terms of being gathered into the covenant, you have to do that through the keys of the priesthood, through that authority. That was the main point of the restoration. That's why we had John the Baptist come, Peter, James, and John, and then Moses, Elias, and Elijah in Kirtland. It's to restore all of those keys that had been taken, and then they needed to be returned so that we could do this work of gathering. And so what it means to gather is to be gathered into the covenant, and to become one with the covenant people of the Lord. So that's what we're working on. And we do want to gather the Lamanites. Now, this is something that's actually been going on for a while, and I want to talk a little bit about that. There was something that triggered this video. I'm going to show you really quickly. I'm not going to go through it. I could put the link in the description of the video if I don't forget. If I do, you guys can comment and then I'll add it. But sometimes I just forget to do things like that. But there was a video that I saw. This was DW News. And they were talking about that speech that J.D. Vance gave recently. He's the Vice President of the United States. And he's like pretty hardcore conservative, very straightforward. He's just all about free speech, all about freedom of religion. The First Amendment is the main goal of this administration, per this speech that he gave. And he lectured the European nations, specifically Germany. This was taking place in Munich. And he like hardcore lectures the Europeans for not upholding free speech and democracy like they claim. He gives tons of examples. He basically says America doesn't want to work with people who aren't going to support freedom and democracy, especially freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And he feels like they just weren't doing that. It reminded me very much of when the lion lectures the eagle in 2nd Esdras. I recently read a proclamation from 1845 on my channel. You can look at it. But it's like a 19th century prophecy, basically. It prophesies just all these things for the end time leading up to the second coming. And I mean, it was like an official proclamation of the church. And it was just so interesting because it reminded me a lot also of this lion lecturing the eagle. And I talked about that in that video too. And you can look that up, but it's in 2nd Esdras, the Apocrypha. In chapter 11, there's this part where the lion at the end of the chapter is lecturing this eagle beast that's like a remnant of all of the former kingdoms that, according to Daniel, come down and break out into these little toes that are left. And so it seemed like that's what he was doing. He was basically saying the same things that this lion says to this eagle, which I thought was so interesting. And it was just fresh in my mind because I had just barely done a video on it, and I was linking it more to that proclamation of 1845, which does talk about America's end time role. And some things that I've learned as I've been digging into this and then just reading that proclamation, which you can go listen to. I read it just for your benefit so that, because it's like 16 pages and it's a lot of reading. It took me an hour to read it. So if you just want to listen to it, you can go find that video on my channel. I just posted a couple days ago. It's called like 19th Century Prophecies, something like that. Let's see. I think it was... yeah, this one. Second Coming Prophecies in the 1845 Proclamation on the Restoration. So check out that video. You can listen to that. It's really, really cool. And it does talk quite a bit about America's end time role in gathering Israel. And some things that I've learned that I've been thinking about that I want to share with you. Food for thought. You can think about it. Let me know in the comments what you think. But here's some things that I've thought of. So I was thinking about like just different scriptural and doctrinal threads, just kind of exploring Joseph in Egypt as this allegorical lesson for our day. I do think it pertains to the United States and to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think it pertains to the concept of establishing New Jerusalem and Old Jerusalem as these religious epicenters and ensigns to the nations. I do think that some of this has still to be fulfilled, obviously, in the old world. But here in the United States, we have the church, we have the Salt Lake Temple that is actually about to reopen in the next few years. And this at Temple Square, we have this connection to Isaiah where it talks about the Lord's house being established in the top of the mountains. You guys have heard this for decades if you've grown up in the church from prophets and apostles quoting this. So I think like culturally we understand that this is an ensign to the nations. Well, think about the United States of America in the last days, because there's a couple of talks that came to mind. One was the Divine Constitution talk that Benson gave, President Ezra Taft Benson, and I have the links down here. We'll pull those up shortly and we'll look at those. And then also the one that Dallin H. Oaks gave years ago. It was in like 2021, I think was his most recent one, but he's given a couple. And they basically talk about how the Constitution of the United States, it's like the first of its kind, it's the longest lasting of its kind, and it's one that is established by God. They talk about the Puritans, basically all the Europeans that came over and established the country, including the founding fathers being led by God. They talk about Christopher Columbus. They talk about like all these as being parts of what Nephi saw, the things that he prophesied. And you're probably familiar with those talks, so I'm not going to like spend a ton of time on them, but just think about them as we're going through this. The Book of Mormon definitely talks about America being a part of this end time gathering of Israel. It talks about it being a land of liberty, which helps the gospel covenant go forward. And if you think about the signs of the times, this is important because without America, we can't have the restored church. The discovery of America and the establishment of the United States of America was necessary. And the whole point of Daniel, his vision, it shows that breaking down of those very powerful early empires so that one day America could be established. In the last dispensation, we could have a restoration and there would be liberty spreading throughout the earth. And that is coming to pass. We see that. We see it happening. This is how scattered Israel is going to be gathered. We're going to have liberty, that those doors to the nations will continue to open up because of priesthood keys that have been restored. And the restoration will roll forward like the stone cut out of the mountain without hands. That covenant restored, that ancient covenant restored. And eventually this will lead to a full end of all nations and Jesus Christ ruling and reigning on the earth. So that's kind of like the idea you can think about with regard to the signs of the times. It's just how these signs are coming to pass and why liberty is so important to that process. We know that the original war in heaven was over liberty. Well, Ether 2:12, you guys have heard this one a million times, I'm sure, but this verse talks about the land of promise being a choice land where freedom and righteousness are required if you're going to live on this land. If not, you're going to be swept off the land. It says, behold, this is a choice land, and whatsoever nation shall possess it shall be free from bondage and from captivity and from all other nations under heaven, if they'll but serve the God of the land, who's Jesus Christ, who's been manifested by the things which we've written. Doctrine and Covenants talks about this too in section 101, verses 77 through 80. Second Nephi, chapter 1, verse 7. Lehi speaks about the land being preserved for those who worship the God of the land, who's Jesus Christ. And that says, wherefore this land is consecrated unto him whom he shall bring. And if it so be that they shall serve him according to the commandments which he hath given, it shall be a land of liberty unto them, wherefore they shall never be brought down into captivity. If so, it shall be because of iniquity. For if iniquity shall abound, cursed be the land for their sakes. Now this happened. So remember, after Christ appeared to the Nephites and the Lamanites in 3rd Nephi, they were peaceable and living righteously for up to 400 years, and then sometime from 400 AD on, they apostatized, and the great apostasy finally set in. And this is the covenant curses that came on them for falling into iniquity, and they actually became so bloodthirsty and brutal that they were killing each other off, and it was just a very sad ending to the Book of Mormon. And poor Moroni was wandering by himself for a very long time because of this. Well, we saw that happen to those people, and it'll happen again to people in our day who do not follow Jesus Christ, who don't live the laws of his gospel. And, this can happen to us in the church too. I mean, we have two choices, and we need to make the right one. Sign number 2 in David J. Ridge's book, 100 Signs of the Times, is the discovery of America and the establishment of the United States. He lists the scriptures that talk about this. So we know this is a sign of the times. We've seen it happening. It's one of those that's fulfilled. This is all in preparation for the second coming. We get this a little bit in Ether 2:12. We see the gathering of Israel being emphasized by President Nelson and really all the prophets. This is a very deep doctrine that they've all emphasized. And we see that Ephraim and Manasseh, these tribes they have like this central role in the fulfillment of these latter-day prophecies. And many of the early members of the church we know are from these two tribes, and that makes sense because this was part of that birthright blessing that they would receive the gospel first in the end time, and then they would bring it to the rest of the house of Israel and to the lost tribes. That's been happening. That's what we're doing. We're gathering into this covenant. We're sharing the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant with all nations. We have those keys to unlock those nations. It'll happen over time. There are many lessons that I see in the story of Joseph in Egypt. I've spent a lot of time studying this in recent years because I'm starting to realize that this pertains to me personally. I can see how there's this responsibility of preserving life. This includes spiritually. In fact, it emphasizes spiritually preserving life. We do work for the gathering of Israel on both sides of the veil. Bringing people into the gospel covenant is what it's all about. Blessing the nations. We bless the nations. We're like the salt of the earth, the leaven in the bread. We help bring blessings. Like when we keep our covenants, the whole earth is blessed. And it reminds me of in 2015 when there was this emphasis on the Sabbath day, and we were promised by our prophet and apostles that if we, as members of the church, would keep the Sabbath day holy, then the whole earth would be blessed. It's that concept that we are proxy saviors and we can bring blessings through our righteousness. So if we could ever unify and be that Zion people and live righteously, the whole earth would be blessed. Forgiveness and unity is another theme in that story, and I feel like Joseph's reunion with his brothers, especially with Judah, there's like this beautiful reunion that he has with his brother, and he unites the whole house of Israel. He saves them both temporally and spiritually. He unites all the tribes, and this is the role of the church in the last days and also of America. So this land is the land where Joseph's descendants live. If they aren't converted yet to the gospel, then they're kind of represented in the idea of Jacob. If they have been introduced to the gospel and have entered into, like started on that covenant path, then this kind of represents the idea of when Jacob's name changes to Israel, and we want to become Israel, and then we want to, from there, become a Zion people. And, these are kind of like the steps in our progression. And there are a lot of people in the United States who have rejected the gospel, at least the restored Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but they're still Christians. They believe in Christ and they try to follow his laws and his commandments. And, there's like a whole other side lesson there, but I'm just trying to help you think about, how there's these two types. They're all the house of Israel. Some of them are converted and some of them are unconverted in terms of the restored gospel. But we're all kind of working toward that purpose. And when I was watching that video where J.D. Vance was like giving this lecture to the Europeans, I couldn't help but see in him the desire that Jacob has and the story of Jacob, who eventually becomes Israel, because there is so much that he said that has to do with these principles that America is built on, and that comes from God. The founding fathers were inspired by God. They were led by God. And we know that because that's what Nephi told us. And so I just think there's so many examples in the scriptures that we can look at. So like there's this promised land narrative. We see that in ancient Israel being a promised land. We see it in the founding of the United States, that God uses this land to prepare a place where the restoration could take place. We see it with the Jaredite history. They came to America as well as a place of freedom and refuge. We see it in the story of Joseph, his coat of many colors. It's like a coat of light. It has all kinds of priestly connotations, divine birthright representations, temple symbolism, but also just this concept of his responsibility. He has many responsibilities, and there's many blessings on his lineage. And with those blessings comes these responsibilities. And then we've got teachings from modern prophets like Ezra Taft Benson, who I mentioned with regard to the Constitution. He's talked so much about that. And then even President Nelson's been talking so much about the gathering of Israel. I mentioned Dallin H. Oaks. He also gave a talk about the Constitution and its divinity. And so I feel like we are familiar with these concepts. We understand that America has a special role in the end time. It's one of being a city of refuge, a place of peace and safety for those who want to serve the Lord. Now, for those who don't, it becomes a curse. And so I think if you just pay attention to the things that are going on, you'll see that pattern over time. And then there's this other thing that I wanted to show you really quickly. This was an LDS Living article. It's by Gerald Lund. He's an Emeritus General Authority 70. He used to be in the 70, and he's done tons of stuff. He's a scholar for our church, and he's got tons of articles in the Gospel Library app. He's contributed to our Institute manual specifically about the book of Revelation. Well, he had commented back in March of 2021 on some things that President Nelson had said with regard to the gathering of Israel. He came out with a book that year called The Second Coming of the Lord, which was a follow-up to a book called The Coming of the Lord. I've read The Second Coming of the Lord. It's a really great book, and I feel like I learned a lot from it. But he points out how this gathering of Israel is super important. He quotes President Nelson talking about how there's this hastening of the Lord's work going on to gather Israel, that the gathering is the most important thing taking place on the earth today. Nothing compares to it in magnitude. He talks about just all of these different times when President Nelson has addressed this about bringing the children of Abraham back into the fold, that's what we're doing. He quotes Jeremiah 16, Jeremiah 31, where it's talking about the tribes being gathered, where it's talking about putting the law of the Lord in our inward parts, in their inward parts, as we gather the people. And anyway, I just wanted to show this to you as a resource, because I think if you read this, he just makes a lot of really good points about things that President Nelson has said, emphasizing the gathering of Israel. And he talks about how this is actually a really deep doctrine, and he was surprised that President Nelson even started teaching it to 13-year-olds. And he feels like this is like the whole point of the gospel, and I couldn't agree more. So I wanted to show you that, and then I wanted to show you a couple of other things. So with regard to the Lamanites blossoming as a rose, this is sign number 73 in David J. Ridge's book, 100 Signs of the Times. He lists the scriptures that pertain to that. Doctrine and Covenants 49, 24, and 2 Nephi 30, verses 4 through 6 specifically. There's a connection between when the Lamanites start to blossom as a rose and the New Jerusalem being built. And I don't want to tell you how to take that or interpret it. I just want you to see that there's a connection. If you look at these scriptures and you study this, you're going to see that the Lamanites are called to help build the New Jerusalem. And I think if you look at how many stakes and temples we have in Mexico and South America, you will see that this is coming to pass. Like our church membership in South America is huge, and even in Central America. So I feel like we are seeing that, and it's happening, and this is a sign of the New Jerusalem prophecies starting to unfold. This means that you're getting closer to these prophecies being fulfilled. So I need to just kind of think about that, and you can kind of look at that on your own. I'm not going to get into that. There's this other talk by Gene R. Cook. This is from 1980. Gene R. Cook was also a member of the 70. He gave one of my favorite talks actually on getting answers to prayers. I have it on a CD. It's so old. But he's just such a good speaker. Well, he talked about how there was a time where him and his wife, they were in South America among the Lamanites, the children of Lehi, the people of the Book of Mormon, a people of great promise, he called them. He said, for a number of years, we've been witnesses to spiritual miracles among that people. He said, we've seen thousands converted to the Lord who had his law put into their minds and written in their hearts. We've seen them organized to numerous stakes of Zion. We've truly seen them blossom as the rose. A prophecy has been fulfilled through them. We've literally seen the Lord perform miracles among them by their faith. This was back in 1980. There's this talk called Ministering to the Needs of Members, and it's from President Spencer W. Kimball. And he talks about how he is also noticing that the Lamanites are joining the church, and he's saying that we no longer merely teach and preach to them, but we must establish the church among them. And he says this statement doesn't just apply to the Lamanites. He's thinking big. He's thinking total prophecies. And so he says this applies to all cultures. And he talks about a program that was set up to help with the language barriers. And he counsels everyone to think of us in the church as family building people, that we need to overcome these language and cultural barriers so that we can spread this gospel covenant throughout the earth. And this is like a priority for the church. And then there's this other talk that is called The Evil of Intolerance. And this one really touched me. It's from 1954, so much earlier. And this is kind of like before we get to this point where he's saying, hey, now we need to establish the church among the Lamanites. This is back when the church is barely starting to preach to them, to like different tribal peoples, different native peoples in the whole continent, the American continent, and in the Isles of the Sea. And I'm actually going to go pull this one up in Citation Index because I just want to show you a couple of things in here that I highlighted. I'm going to start here at the top and just show you some of these things that I've highlighted. Basically, he addresses a letter that he received from somebody who was anonymous. He was very upset about it. He was angry, and he's very straightforward about how angry he is. And I think it's just so Spencer W. Kimball. I just love this man. His book, Miracle of Forgiveness, changed my life. I love how straightforward he is. He's such a hard hitter, and I love it. He talks about in this, at the very beginning, how he loves seeing in the congregation, in the conference, that there's more Japanese, Chinese, Hawaiians, Islanders, Indians, Mexicans, Spanish Americans, and he just wants to see more of these minorities joining the church because he recognizes that they're the house of Israel and the lost tribes. He talks about how there's these people who wrote this letter to him. He says that they didn't have the courage to sign their name to their statements. They sent it to him as anonymous. He says that they were talking about like this superior race idea, which in 1954 was totally a thing. So the sacred places desecrated by the invasion of everything that is forced on the white race is what they had said in this letter. And he says that now this letter is going to go into the fire, but it'll give him some talking points today. So then he goes on, he's upset about these intolerant expressions, and that while there's an ever increasing number of people who are kind and willing to accept minority groups as they come into the church, there's still many who speak disparaging terms, who priest-like and Levite-like pass by on the other side of the street. He's referencing the story of the Good Samaritan. And I actually had done a video recently where we looked at the Sermon on the Mount and the story of the Good Samaritan, and this idea of evil speaking of the Lord's anointed in connection with living the law of the gospel, which is that third covenant that we make in the temple. And we looked at how this is in connection with the first two commandments, which is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and soul and mind, and love thy neighbor as thyself. And this concept of loving thy neighbor as thyself ties into not speaking evil against the Lord's anointed, and also with the Good Samaritan, because that was the story, the parable that the Savior gave on how to love the Lord and our neighbor. And so he's referencing this, and just think deeper about it is what I'm saying. Think about this very deeply. Think about it specifically in connection with your temple covenants. This is something we covenant to do. And not speaking of the Lord's, like ill of the Lord's anointed, goes beyond the prophets and the apostles. We're all the Lord's anointed. And that was the point of that video. And I want you to think about that right now as you're listening to President Spencer W. Kimball mention the Good Samaritan. And every time you hear the Good Samaritan, think about the law of the gospel and what you covenant to do in the temple, and the things that we're warned not to do and counseled not to do, like speaking evil of the Lord's anointed. This has to do with our heart. It has to do with that Sermon on the Mount, with Matthew 5:11, blessed are you, and men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. That is what he's addressing here. And he's saying that people in the church are doing that. And then he talks about how we need to start calling the natives our Lamanite brothers and sisters. And we need to think of them that way because they're part of the house of Israel. We need to gather them in. And you can see from 1954 to 1980 that there was a huge shift. There was a great gathering that started to unfold. And you can see that at a certain point in time, there was like this really harsh lecture happening to people in the church to change that attitude, to, do away with those feelings of intolerance or racism, and start realizing that this covenant needs to go to the entire world. And so we can see that over time, the Lord is working through his prophet to help bring his people up to a higher level in their hearts, a higher, holier heart is what the Lord is trying to develop in us, in the church. And I can see it just like from reading general conference talks over time. And this is one that stood out to me. So he says, and think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father, for I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. He's quoting Matthew 3:7-9. And this is where the Savior is talking with like the Pharisees, and they're just like, oh, well, Abraham's our father. And they're thinking about like their blood connection to Abraham as though this somehow makes them a superior race. And we know through study that the way we become children of Abraham is to do the works of Abraham, to abide in the covenants that he made with the Lord, to abide in our covenants with the Lord. Anyone else will not be children of Abraham. And so he talks about how Jesus Christ personally appeared to the lost sheep of the house of Israel because they're important. They are his children, and we need to view everyone that way. He talks about how the Lord has made all flesh equal. And why shouldn't we do that? If the Lord has accepted both Gentiles and Israel, and he finds no difference between them, then why would we? Why would we exclude anyone from the church and its activities? We want to bring those blessings of salvation to everyone, and really exaltation too. He says intolerance is an ugly creature. He says we don't want to be the hypocrites, the ones with the beam in our eye and, seeing the mote in our brother's eye. He just gives so many examples, and I don't have time to go through all of them. But ultimately, what this builds up to is that we have a responsibility. This is America and the church. We have a responsibility as the descendants of Joseph in Egypt, living on this land of promise, to be nursing parents. And he refers to all of these people around the world, these natives, these tribal people, these people who were originally on this continent, as ungerminated seeds that will come to life, and the harvest will be fabulous. And all they need is the sunshine of the gospel truth and the ability to cultivate it through the programs and training of the church. And remember, Elder Holland recently called the church the vehicle. And we've also heard those, I think it was Bruce R. McConkie maybe, or it might have been, it was one of the prophets. I'm using it in my presentation that I'm working on for the keys of the priesthood, but about how the church is the scaffolding. So there's that analogy too. And it gives you the idea that the church is a tool. It's a structure that the Lord uses to help bring us into the covenant and to carry that covenant to all the people in the earth. And it's to help bring families to the Lord. And anyway, he goes on and he starts naming some of these people. He says some of them could be now called Lagunas or Shoshones. Perhaps the children of the Ammonites are with us. They could be called Zunis or Hopis. They may be Navajos or Cherokees. They may be called Mayas or Pimas, Paiutes or Mohicans. And he says that these are all Lamanite Nephites, and that we should not spurn these Lamanite Nephites or Nephite Lamanites. And that these are living descendants who have the seeds of faith and growth and development and honor and integrity and greatness in them, and they wait for just the opportunity. They're waiting for the gospel. Well, from 1954 to 1980, I can see that there was a shift in the church, that we did see the lost tribes come and start to receive those blessings from Ephraim, and they've been being brought back into the gospel fold, into the covenant that their fathers had. You guys have probably seen this video that shows the temple timeline, like all the temples that are dotting the earth. And I think this is really, really illustrative of how far and wide the gospel covenant is spreading, and how these lost tribes are starting to be gathered one by one out of the earth. And so this is speaking to the lost tribes like the Lamanites, that original house of Israel, the descendants of Lehi, and then it's also speaking about Judah and their role, like their part, where the Lord is going to gather them as well. And we know that there's these 4 key appearances of Jesus Christ. He appears to his prophets and apostles, Adam on Amen. He appears to the New Jerusalem in America, and then the Old Jerusalem in the Old World, and then he's going to appear to the whole earth. But the concept there is an order in which he's appearing to the people and he's gathering them. And that last gathering is going to be with the help of Judah and the Lamanites, all these 3 original branches of the house of Israel that are mentioned in Jacob 5. And then they're going to go and gather the rest of the people who will come and be part of this Abrahamic covenant out of the non-Christian nations, which the scriptures call the heathen nations. But look at this. Look at America. Look at South America. Look at Mexico. The majority of the temples on the earth are there. And then also look at all the little islands, all the islands of the sea. The islands and North and South America. This is the lost tribes and those descendants of Lehi, Ephraim and Manasseh, and those lost tribes. They're all being gathered, and they get gathered first. And so Ephraim gets gathered, and then Ephraim and Manasseh start gathering the lost tribes, and then they're going to go gather the Jews. And it's happening, it's starting. And eventually, there's going to be some prosperous missionary work happening in these regions of the world that you see that are still without maybe the ability for us to proselytize. Israel is one of those places that we can't really proselytize right now. But if you study the Holy Land prophecies, which I've done a video on, I think you'll see that our prophets and apostles believe that that will happen one day. So anyway, I just wanted to remind you of that and just look at this map and think about that as we talk about this concept of America and its end time role. Because we are supposed to be a place of safety and refuge. And I think when you just look at the number of temples, you get an understanding that that is starting to happen. And so the other thing that I want to look at really quickly before we go and end this video is a couple of these verses that had to do with that sign of the times about the Lamanites blossoming as a rose. So let's pull those up. So the first one is Doctrine and Covenants, section 49, and it was verse 24. So let's look at that. It says, "But before the great day of the Lord shall come, Jacob shall flourish in the wilderness, and the Lamanites shall blossom as the rose." So this idea of blossom, think about what President Spencer W. Kimball was just talking about, all of the potential of these Lamanite people, that they have the seeds of faith, that they're like ungerminated seeds that will come to life, and the harvest will be fabulous. This is a fabulous harvest that you see happening here with all these temples dotting this land. A very fabulous harvest. And it is those seeds coming to life. This is what blossom as the rose looks like. Now, I want to read a little bit of commentary here by, this is by Donald W. Perry and J.A. Perry from this book, Understanding the Signs of the Times. And they say these verses may speak of a restoration of deserts as Latter-day Saint communities cultivate and irrigate acres of land in Utah and elsewhere, bringing forth great crops and forests. More significantly, however, the verses refer to metaphorically the way that Jacob and the Lamanites will flourish spiritually as they repent of all their sins and communicate with God in prayer by asking and knocking. The verbs flourish used twice and blossom, like in Jacob and the Lamanites, to plants. As they receive the light of Christ and the gifts of the Spirit, they'll flourish spiritually as plants flower after receiving water and sunlight. Zion shall rejoice upon the hills and flourish is found 3 times in the Doctrine and Covenants, underscoring its importance. Isaiah used similar imagery. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given unto it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. Israel shall blossom and bud and fill the face of the world with fruit. For Isaiah's prophetic world, the words desert and wilderness relate not only to a barren and desolate land, but to a people or a nation who lack the living waters of Jesus Christ. When Isaiah prophesies that the desert shall blossom as the rose, he refers to the restoration of the gospel. At the time of the great apostasy, the church was driven into the wilderness. But when the gospel was restored through Joseph Smith, the church came forth from the wilderness. So the great day of the Lord, this phrase refers to the second coming. Jacob shall flourish in the wilderness. This passage speaks of Jacob and Lamanites and Zion, which shall flourish in the wilderness and on the hills. Other scriptures use similar metaphors. Of note is the word rejoice, also used in the passage, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. In Isaiah 35:1, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. Isaiah 35:2, Zion shall rejoice upon the hills and flourish. Doctrine and Covenants 35:24, bring forth Zion that it may rejoice upon the hills and flourish. D&C 39:13, Zion shall flourish upon the hills and rejoice upon the mountains. And that's D&C 49:25. As soon as the gospel was restored to the earth, in this dispensation, Jacob, or the house of Israel, began to flourish as a flower in the wilderness. it germinates and grows. This rejoicing and flourishing come to Israel from Christ and his power to bring light, nourishment, and living water to all who draw unto him. So we're talking about covenants. Think about the baptismal font under the temple and the living waters. The Lamanites shall blossom as the rose. The Lamanites are a remnant of the house of Israel. They'll flourish and blossom. See also 2 Nephi 36, 3 Nephi 5:22, Doctrine and Covenants 3:20, 28 and 8, and also 36. As a rose blossoms when receiving light and water. The place which I have appointed. And then he has some commentary about that place. He also talks about how, behold, the word means pay attention. So when you see behold, it means pay attention. It's repeated 3 times in the final 3 verses of Doctrine and Covenants, section 49. He says, repent of all your sins. He says, Zion flourishes when she repents of her sins, individually and collectively. And so think about, again, Spencer W. Kimball calling us to repentance back in 1954, and then how much things changed from 1954 to 1980 and then up through today. I mean, that this map shows us how much that flourishing collectively has happened and how over time this is starting to be prophecy fulfilled. He says, I'll go before you. I'll be your rearward. The Lord promises and parallels the words of Isaiah. The Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rearward. Like the captain of an army, God will go before his people, leading them and protecting them. And similar to a military rear guard, the Lord will safeguard his people from behind. In this, as in all things, he is the first and the last, our Alpha and Omega. And this makes me think of those eclipses. Because these total solar eclipses that are 7 years apart, 2017, 2024 in America, cross over and mark a land that was an exodus for modern Israel that was led by Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. A place that they ended up is the desert of Utah, which is like the upside down mirror version of the land of Israel, also a desert. And anciently, Moses led the children of Israel through the Red Sea on dry ground to their promised land. And even though he didn't get to go in and inherit it, the young generation did. And there's going to be identical eclipses that are also 7 years apart that pass over the Red Sea on August 2nd, 2027 and March 20th, 2034. And to me, this reminds me so much of these 2 exoduses and this concept of gathering Israel. And these 2 epicenters where Jesus Christ will have his thrones, his house established. And so these are some of the things that I've been thinking about with regard to just the news, seeing America playing a certain role, which is one of protecting liberty and religious freedom specifically. And that is something that J.D. Vance specifically mentioned when he was lecturing these European nations. And it just made me smile a little bit, I guess, because I was just like, wow, he's doing this work. He's fulfilling that end time role and mission of America by standing up for these principles of liberty. And I'm not really sure if he's going to follow through or what this administration's going to do. But I do think that America is supposed to be that city of refuge from the storms and the calamities and the wars that are sweeping over the earth. And at some point it may come here too. But ultimately what we want to do is be the Lord's people and provide safety and peace in the covenant. And I think we see the church fulfilling this role. We have the welfare program. We have a missionary program. We've been preaching and teaching to the Lamanites for a long time, trying to gather them. And it's happening, you guys. It's happening. So I just want to leave you that as food for thought about the signs of the times, specifically with regard to the Lamanites blossoming as a rose, and this idea of America's end time role in connection with that story of Joseph in Egypt. So like the video if you liked it. Let me know in the comments your thoughts if you have anything you want to add or discuss. I'd love to know. And that's all for this one.